Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 1 tells us that the day that we die is better than the day that we are born. Death is not an event that the majority of people often look forward to, as death produces grief, sorrow, and mourning. However, verse 3 tells us that it is those moments of emotional distress that have a refining influence on us. While there is anticipation, dreams, and hopes at the moment of birth, death and its byproduct of emotions reminds us of our mortality and the uncertainty of life that in turn should cause us to look past the here and the now and trouble us enough to search for the meaning of life and contemplate what lies beyond the moment of death. And while birth springs life for an undetermined amount of time, death is the closing chapter that will ultimately define the meaning of it. When we view life in light of death, our views regarding death begin to define how life is lived. Our life and legacy is not defined by a moment of success or a moment of failure. While it may very well affect the trajectory of our lives, at the end of the day, it's a journey that defines us.
So in 2018, we began at a church, and it began with its first meeting at Burlington Northern Park. It's a train station, the old train station. And the reason that we started really became the foundation of why we're here today. When it comes to looking for a church, one of the things that most people do is they look for a church ultimately, maybe that fits in what they grew up in. So this is what I was taught is right, whether it be Catholicism, whether it be Mormonism, any kind of the isms, or any kind of religion or denomination. And we just start to look for churches. And one of the things that tends to happen is we look for a church that ultimately fits what we know, or if not, we look for a church that ultimately feels like it can become a place where we can call home. One of the things that we rarely do, if ever, is look for a church that will ultimately grow us in what we consider to be the fundamentals and foundation of our faith. So we look for everything else except that. In 2018, when we started Epicenter, one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to start a church that would move past the barriers of tradition, not because tradition is always bad, but one of the things that happens is tradition can often replace godliness. We often look at how people will die on the altar of tradition rather than dying on the altar of godliness, doing what is right. And the other thing is we want to speak the truth unapologetically. We want to speak the truth that maybe would be difficult for people to wrestle with, but nonetheless, it would address the issue that the Bible continually addresses over and over again. So we started this journey, and it began 6 years ago on the 10th of June, and there was definitely great moments of success, and there was also moments that maybe didn't look the greatest. But one of the things that we wanted to remain true in is preaching the truth unapologetically. We also wanted to make sure and convey that truth as a church. So talk about sin, but also make sure and never undermine God's grace. All right, that God can meet people in their brokenness. So when we started Epicenter, one of the things that began to happen is we wanted to figure out how do we build a church that is not just like every other. Now that's not to say that we want to just simply be different for the sake of being different. We want it to be different because sometimes you see that churches become the same thing over and over again. And I'm not talking about organization, I'm not talking about anything else, but we didn't want to become a church that ultimately was the same, right? They claim to stand on the truth, but ultimately failed to practice it, or if not, they claim to practice the truth, but they failed to love. And we want to define that well. And when it came to starting the church, there was a group of individuals that kind of became part of this vision. And I think one of the greatest successes of the church, for one, by the grace and the hand of God, but outside of that, it was that people understood the concept of what we were trying to build. It was that people understood the culture that would become part of Epicenter. And when it comes down to who we are, the moment that we fail to be who we established to be, we are no longer Epicenter, we're just simply another church. And our desire was to convey that not only through who we are, what we do, but even in the name. So, while there might be many churches that use biblical names to identify their church, whether it be shalom or whatever word of the Bible you want to use, we wanted to use something different that would identify who we are. And the word became Epicenter. And not Epicenter, Epicenter. And the reason that Epicenter became that word is because that is where we want to meet people. Part of that story is really how people got behind the banner and said, hey, yeah, I can get behind that. I believe that to be true. That aside from the name, it's really hard to really identify who we are as a church. And today I want to share that story with you as we look back now to the 10-year mark. It's been 6 days since June 10th. So we're kind of recapping. Last week you got to enjoy the snacks. Today you get to listen to the story. And when we started, it all started with a difficult season in life that at that point I thought was the most difficult one. It by far has been overshadowed by now. But it started, and it was this moment where there's this desire that you want to cultivate in our community. A desire to reach people who are lost. A desire to reach people who maybe don't feel like they belong in church. A desire to reach people who have questions, but they feel like there's no answers. That was the desire. And in that process, there was a time where it just felt like what people wanted was, they wanted church, they didn't want outreach. They wanted to make sure and feed the people that were there, but they didn't want the people that would make them feel uncomfortable. They didn't want the people that maybe didn't look as religious as them, that maybe didn't fit the narrative of church people. And as I looked at Scripture, I'm like, but that is who we are to go after, is the people that ultimately are lost, like we talked about a few weeks ago about the prodigal. We want to reach the people who maybe don't know their right hand from their left. And that was our desire. Epicenter started, and at that time, and even now, you know, I've dealt with depression for a number of years now, severe depression. And during this season, this is how the name Epicenter came to be. We were in this turmoil of season in life, and it was a difficult season in life, and my wife sent me this message. And it's a message that I've shared many times because it's a great way of looking at life. And I want to share that message today. This is a message, it's not word for word verbatim, but it gives you the nutshell of how Epicenter was birthed, and maybe a word of encouragement for all of us here that maybe are in the midst of discouragement. And we find ourselves at the epicenter of life, where life is just falling apart. If you don't know what Epicenter is, if you turn the weather channel on, or even if you were to turn the news on, whenever there is, let's just, Lord forbid, but a terrorist attack or there is a tornado, ultimately they will talk about the epicenter of the storm. That is where the most damage has been done. That's what epicenter means. It's a central part of something difficult. So during this time, once again, in my mind, I thought that was like the worst time of the season of life. It's, like I said, it's been overshadowed greatly by now, but I was going through this midst of depression, and I was told about this story. We talked about this gentleman last week, if you joined us for that service, a prophet by the name of Elijah. This is a man who was taken up to heaven. He disappeared. Elisha becomes his successor, and he saw everything that happened. He disappeared in a chariot of fire. So if you didn't catch that message, it is online, but nonetheless, This is the story of Elijah before he is taken to heaven. So his story is recorded in what we're going to focus in 3 chapters. First Kings. It's not Second Kings. When my wife said on the video, it's my fault. I actually said Second Kings. It's First Kings. And we're going to be focusing on chapters 17 through 19. I'm going to try to really quickly go through the overview so that we kind of get the foundation of where I'm getting at. And I won't be tackling all of it, but I do want to encourage you to go in your own time and really read these 3 chapters. They're of great encouragement, and it really speaks to our humanity. But Elijah is a prophet of God that is mentioned in 1 Kings. And in the first verse of chapter 17, it says that now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, "As surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel lives, the God that I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word." Then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go to the east and hide by the Keith Brook, near where it enters the Jordan River." So I'll stop right there because there is actually no rain that falls. That's what follows. Elijah gives the word. He's a prophet of God. We've talked about this. I'm not going to get into the logistics of it. Within some churches, I remember one time we were sitting with the Millers and we're eating, I believe. And there was a group of individuals and they talked about their prophet in the church. And if you've had conversations about that with me, I'm very skeptical when somebody says that they are a prophet. Because a prophet has the ability to, he's a spokesperson for God here on earth. And I believe that idea of prophets has been done with. As a matter of fact, that's what closed the canon, the 66 books of the Bible. So when somebody says that they're a prophet, here's the thing. I would say, then make fire fall from the sky. Do something that will ultimately identify you as a prophet. So when it came to prophets, when they said something, there was typically something that would follow as a miraculous sign that would ultimately be the identifying factor to say, hey, they are speaking from God. And that's what happens here. Elisha says there will be no rain. There is no rain. And then God tells him, go and hide by the brook. And then it says, drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food. So Elisha did as the Lord told him and camped beside the Kerith brook, east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. So Elijah, being a prophet, says there will be no rain falls. Not only that, but God, during this time of famine and drought, ultimately is going to provide for Elijah. And we're seeing how he provides it supernaturally, as much as there are natural factors where a raven is feeding him and bringing him bread. Ultimately, it's God who is providing, right? There's a brook that has water, and then there's a raven. So this is just setting up what Elisha's experiencing, right? Elisha's experiencing God's sustaining power in his life. Verse 8, then the Lord said to Elijah, go, the brook dries up, I should say, and then it says, the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. So now the brook dries up, and Elijah's told, hey, go now, and there's going to be a widow who will provide for you, or who will ultimately feed you. And that's exactly what Elisha does. So Elisha goes and he said to her, don't be afraid, go ahead and do just what you've said. So I'm going to fill in the blanks here. That's why I said it's important for you to go and read it afterwards. But Elisha goes and asks her to prepare some bread for her. And she says that all that she has left is just one meal. She was going to go and prepare the meal for her and for her son. That's all that there is. She has no husband. And ultimately, they were going to eat that last meal and then prepare to die. But Elisha said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what I've said. He asked for her to prepare a meal for him first and then for them. And that would be difficult, right? Imagine somebody coming and saying, it sounds selfish. Hey, prepare a meal for me and then prepare one for yourselves. Feed me first before you feed yourselves. And you're thinking, I only have a meal for two, and ultimately it was going to be my son and I, and then we're going to prepare to die. But now this widow is told, prepare one for the prophet Elijah, and then prepare one for yourselves. In order for her to ultimately do that, it would require something. It would require faith that what he is proposing is ultimately going to happen, that God has a plan in it, right? And that's the way that faith works. It's ultimately looking at something and saying, okay, I can't see how this is going to work, but at the same time, I have faith that God will do what he said he's going to do. So, once again, he says, go ahead and do just what you said, but make a little bread for me first, then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. We're going to skip a verse 15. So she did as Elijah said. Once again, that's trusting. And she and Elijah, and by the way, there is a word from God for her there that they will always have enough. And then she does as Elisha said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. And this is just one aspect of the supernatural. Once again, there has been no rain because Elijah said so, because God told him to do that. He has been provided for through ravens and through a brook. And now we see that there is a widow who just had enough flour to make 2 meals for her and her son. But now every time that she's making a meal, because she had faith, there is always enough meals for all 3, and there is always enough. Now imagine for just a second being in your kitchen and you go and get flour, right? Let's just say you go and get flour and you go and take some, you prepare your meal, and it looks like that's your last meal, but then you go back to the flour jar and there's more flour, right? There's always enough. There's always enough. And Elijah's experiencing these things. He's experiencing them firsthand because God is using him to ultimately see his power and his might. Verse 17. Sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He grew worse and worse, and finally he died. Then she said to Elijah, a man of God, "O man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?" Now there's tragedy. Her son, her only son, has died. And in this moment, all of a sudden you realize, hey, this man is from God. Maybe the reason that my son died is because ultimately my sins have been found out. And she says, why do you come here? Even though she's seen God work and provide for them, now she understands, hey, my son's dead. Maybe my son's dead because of what I did. And she starts asking him, why did you come here? My only son is dead. And what follows again is Elijah's now going to pray for her son. And it says that in verse 21, and he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. "Look," he said, "your son is alive." So now at this point, there's been a series of events that have happened that it's pretty hard not to completely trust God, right? That God knows what he is doing. That God is using Elijah for this very moment. And he's seeing miraculous sign after miraculous signs. And we could talk about this during our Series X, but it's all these events that cannot be explained naturally. Now, people can try and say, well, maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe it was just they believed that he was dead, but his life returned. The Bible is clear. It is ultimately because of Elijah's prayer, faith, that the spirit of the son returns. As we go into the following chapter, which is chapter 18, I'm just going to recap that because there's a lot that takes place. But in chapter 18, you're going to get a contest that takes place in Mount Carmel. And in this mountain, Elijah meets with King Ahab and the prophets of Baal. Baal is a false god who ultimately they do wicked practices to worship him. And in this moment, Elijah says, hey, you know what? Let's just have a little contest to see whose God is really real. If Baal is God, then let's worship him. But if Yahweh is God, then let's worship him. And the way that they do this is Elijah proposes, let's just go ahead and prepare a sacrifice. And the one that consumes the sacrifice without starting a fire, that's the real God. So the prophets of Baal gather their sacrifice, and it says that they start praying, and they start chanting, they start screaming, they start cutting themselves so that Baal could respond and catch this sacrifice on fire, but nothing happens. Nothing happens to that sacrifice. And Elijah starts mocking them. Hey, maybe he's busy. Maybe he's relieving himself. Maybe he's doing something, and that's a reason that it's not working. And then it's almost like this fight. Now all of a sudden Elijah comes up. He's a contender. And Elijah, rather than making things easy on himself, he makes it more difficult. Why? Because there is no impossible for God, which is what we've been talking about in our Series X, right? There's nothing that God can't do. And Elijah's going to prove this. He says, hey, you know what? Go and get water and just soak the sacrifice. So they grab water, they soak the sacrifice. But he continues to do this. And remember, it's a drought. They do this so much until the point that the water starts to puddle up. So now it's really hard for that sacrifice to start. And after this, Elijah prays and he says, God, light this fire, right? Prove that you are the one true God. And it says that the sacrifice was completely consumed with fire to the point that it even absorbed all the water that was there. There was nothing left. God is a true God. Yahweh is a true God. So at that point afterwards, the prophets of Baal are killed, and the people follow Yahweh. Now, with that being said, another great victory, right? That it's God who has the victory, but ultimately Elijah's witnessing this. He's seeing everything that's taking place. And afterwards, Elijah says, okay, King Ahab, go back because the rain's about to start falling before it catches you. So now, because it's been proven that Yahweh is God, now it's going to start raining. So Elijah starts praying, and there's nothing, and then all of a sudden they start to see a little cloud, and then it starts to get really, the conditions are ready for rain, and then it just pours, right? Rain falls after it had not rained for years. This is where I want to pause. There has been a lot of things that have happened, and there's difficult seasons in life, right, where you see the son that dies. But even then, Elijah sees that God is able to do the impossible. And Elijah has been on the center of seeing God work. He's just simply a vessel that God is using. But imagine for a second, how many of us would not say, hey, if I would see that, there is no way that I would doubt God. If I could just see God do one miracle, that would be enough to make my life turn around. Now, I want you to understand, all this is taking place. And Elijah, no rain, now there's rain. There has been a sacrifice that has been consumed with fire from heaven that absolutely absorbed everything. He has seen somebody come back to life. He has seen that there's always enough in the flour jar and olive oil so that there could always be enough to eat. God has provided supernaturally through a brook and through a raven. Elijah has seen some incredible things. Most things that most of us would say, once again, if I even saw a fraction of that, I would not doubt. We turn the chapter, right? 17 and 18, now we're at 19. Ahab was told, go home, there's rain coming. And it says that when Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elisha had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah. May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you have killed them. Now there's a threat. Elijah has seen everything. He has been obedient. God has done great things. And now there's this threat that is put on his life. Verse 3. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. After hearing the threat, there's fear, there's panic. And he fears for his life. He has seen how God has done incredible things, yet at the same time, sometimes it doesn't take much. One of the things that I've heard often is when it comes down to life, we will often focus on the bad things than the good things. Or we will often focus on the bad comments rather than every good comment that might encourage us. And this is what's happening here. Elijah's now, he's seen God's hand at work, but he hears that now his life is in danger, and he flees for his life. Then he went down alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. And this is what he says. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. You just have to work backwards and see that there is this man that is filled with the Holy Spirit, and he's seeing great and incredible things where God is working in his life, using him to do some incredible things. It is in a moment of fear and panic that all of a sudden what you're seeing described there is depression. A number of years ago now, I would say at least more than 2, but I decided to go and I want to be careful in how I say this because I'm not suggesting that this is the answer, but I actually ended up going to the doctor to get medicine for depression. And when I got there, I knew that medicine was not going to take care of it because there was just a lot of issues that were going on, a lot of turmoil. And when I went, one of the things that I remember is the doctor asked, have you ever thought about taking your life? And I said, I would say that I've prayed to God to take it for me. Depression isn't always you trying to end your life. Depression is just giving up in life, period. Because you're finding yourself in a very difficult season of life. And that's what we're seeing in Elijah. How? Right? I mean, we question, how is that even possible if he has seen God at work? Here's a man of God, and he wants to die because some person told him that he was going to kill him? It doesn't take much for fear to trigger in us depression, that we just want to be done with life, right? We might not be at the point where we're willing to take our life, but we're at the point where we're asking God to do so. And depression is this brutal thing. And here's the thing. People deal with circumstances differently. Some might not go into depression. Some might just become hermits. Some might just get angry. Everybody deals with it differently. But one of the things that we have to understand is that at the epicenter of those moments, in the most difficult seasons of life, what will tend to happen is life will not seem like it's worth living. Or following God's calling may not seem like what we are willing to do anymore because life has gotten too tough. And just this week, I was talking to an individual, and we were talking about faith, and I was asked if I was religious, and I said, not really. I'm a person of faith. I wouldn't say that I'm religious in the technical sense of what most people envision. I don't wear a robe when I preach on Sundays, far from it. But as we were talking about it, one of the things that I realized is that most people, when they think about faith, they think about a spiritual high. It's almost like a drug, right? You go to church to get the spiritual high where you're just going to feel pumped and ready to go for the week, and nothing's going to beat you down, and you got this covered. That's religion. That's a spiritual high. Here's where most people find themselves, and this is why Epicenter was established. Most people will be all in when it comes to faith when life doesn't have those moments. In those moments, your spiritual highs are going to wear off. You're not going to want to do life. You're not going to want to do the things that you were doing. You're not going to be as energetic and as pumped up to just keep on going. We can reach every person in this community. You know what you're going to feel like doing? Hey, I'm just done. Let's finish this. And we exist, just like this person asked, it's like, are you a religious person? I'm like, I'm a person of faith, and here's the reason why. When it comes to religion, you will get a spiritual high that makes you feel like you can conquer the world, but when life happens, that feeling goes away. Faith tells me that when life gets difficult, God still remains on his throne, even when I can't see it. That when life gets difficult, it is worth pushing forward because God's not done yet. Because there's still something more. If I try to inspire you with religion, when your life falls apart, that will be God. If I try to create a foundation for our church that is based on faith, your eyes are not on your circumstances, your eyes are on the one who will get you through that circumstance. And we're seeing Elijah here, a man who has seen so much. It doesn't matter how much you have seen at times, life gets the better of you. And Elijah says, I want to be done. But then this is what follows, right? So this is the epicenter moment of Elijah. Verse 8 of chapter 19. Elijah gets up and ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. So now Elijah's embarking on this journey in his distress, in his difficulty. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. So Elijah goes towards the mountains, the mountain of God, as he is told to do so, after wanting to die, right? Life is falling apart. But then it says on verse 11 that the Lord says, go out and stand before me on the mountain. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And what we begin to see here is that God is meeting with Elijah in that mountain. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a whisper. That's where God meets Elijah. It's in that moment. In that moment of difficulty where he tells him, go to the mountain, right? Elijah doesn't want anything having to do with it. As a matter of fact, did you notice how he was comparing himself to others? Hey, I'm no better than this individual. I'm no better than my ancestors. Just kill me. Just take my life. It's depression. But God meets him there, and he meets him in the most unexpected way. Every other aspect of God meeting people, we've seen that there's been earthquakes, we've seen lightning, we've seen all these things, but we're seeing that there's this experience that Elijah is having, and God is not in any of those things. It's in a whisper. As a dad, I found myself at times, the most intimate moments are when I'm trying to get my kids' attention. It's no longer screaming. You start with screaming. But then you get to this point where you're just needing to comfort them. And you grab them and you tell them, I'm doing this because I love you. God speaks in the whisper. Not in everything else. It's in a whisper. And that's where God meets Elijah. This is the epicenter. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a cloak and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, what are you doing here? This is where, if you look outside, you will see this logo. This is the reason that Epicenter has that logo. It's Elijah walking up the mountains. It's God meeting him at that moment. In the epicenter of our lives, that is where God will meet us. It's when we embark in that journey. It is when we go on that journey that God will meet us in our difficulties. So, after being here at Epicenter for 6 years, I've been in ministry now for over 10. But in those 6 years, there has been incredible moments of victories. There has been moments that aren't that great. About 2 years ago, there was definitely a moment that wasn't that great. And sometimes our failures really mess things up. And sometimes we just feel like we got to be done. We got to close shop. As a matter of fact, you start feeling worthless. You start feeling like, God can't use you anymore. That depression of, God, take my life. It's not worth living anymore. life loses its flavor, it loses its salt. You just become salty, as a matter of fact. And for the last 6 years, there has been great moments, and I would say for 4 years, my goodness, we saw God move in incredible ways. Where you stand here today wasn't even a location that we had. Like I said, our first service was in Burlington Northern Park. And it's like every time that the train would go by, I would have to speak a little bit louder, or I would have to stop for a second because it was so quiet. It was so quiet for people to hear because the train was so loud. But we started with nothing at all, and everything that you see today was paid for in full, and it was all built upon faith. We saw seasons of growth at Epicenter that were incredible, and we have been through distress moments where the doors were just about closed. We've seen moments of plenty where financially we have been set and been able to reach into our community and do things that really, it was no obstacle. We have been in seasons where we have to look for dimes and pennies to just put into the bank. And I'm just being honest, in those 6 years, and I pray to God that this is 6 years ago when we started Epicenter, I thought that was the worst season of life. Now, 2 years ago was definitely that moment, a very difficult season of life. And I pray to God that he just keeps it there. That's good enough. Let's just keep that being the most difficult season of life. And this is me being honest. One of the things that I've said is I've always said this since day one. I am no less capable of failing than you are because I'm just as human as you are. But one of the things that I want to clarify is I share the same emotions, feelings, frustrations, discouragements that you face. And everything that God did for 4 years was quickly overshadowed. And to be honest, within the last 4 months, I've been to the Epicenter again, where it doesn't feel like it's worth moving. As a matter of fact, it just doesn't feel like it's moving anywhere. And you get discouraged. You grow discouraged. You grow frustrated. You get scared. And one of the things that we have to remember is the Bible is recording our humanity alongside of God's revelation, or Christ's revelation, right? The Bible is primarily revealing Jesus, but alongside we're getting the revelation and the broken condition of humanity. So with that being said, there are moments that encourage us, there are moments that discourage us. One of our sayings here is, it's the journey that defines us. In that journey where Elijah goes, it is a defining moment because he's seeing how God is calling him to go back. He's not done yet. He's scared, he's discouraged, but God's not done. And one of the things that the reason that I wanted to talk about this again was because if I'm being honest, I feel like we're currently in a season where that vision of why we exist is not even there. I think that the church has become what every other church does. It simply becomes a place of belonging. It simply becomes a place of, you enjoy being there. You have your friends there. I've been at churches where I got so sick of how that became the banner that they pushed, right? That's where my friends go, so that's where I'm going. We have all the young families. That's where all the young families are going. It's like, well, there's a lot of people, so it must be a good church. There's churches that have a lot of people that are not good churches to go to, just like there's small churches that are not necessarily biblically solid. So you have to understand that when it comes down to it, I really do believe that to some extent we have gone astray. I think that we've lost sense of that mission. And I was talking to my wife, and I told her, one of the things that is discouraging is I feel like we've gotten stuck on this rut where we are no longer about the mission, we're about comfort. We're about coming to church, doing the church thing, let's just get it done. We're not about growing. I mean, we're growing some, but at the same time, we're not growing in the sense that it's like we're reaching our community and doing part of that. We're broken people, but at the same time, are we reaching broken people? And I'm speaking primarily for myself right now. It is discouraging when you see what has happened, and at times, it's not that you're comparing it to what was. You're seeing it to what it should be, right? Because the people are the church, but they are not what make the church what it is. In other words, it's not the people that you have that will ultimately define who the church is. It is the people and their desire to reach that make up that church. And that's where I'm at, right? It's that moment of discouragement, year 6. I've been thinking about this a lot, but it's like, maybe it's just a year of incompleteness, right? Or maybe 7th year, that's a year of completeness, that will be better. And I just really wanted to tell you why we exist. We're not just another church. And I know that every church says that. We're grounded in the truth. I know every church says that. If you were on Wednesday, we got together for our Areopagus life group, and that's one of the things that I shared is, at times it's tempting just to speak an encouraging message that's going to get you pumped up and really try to get you out the door and just feel great about yourself. Hey, I want to encourage you in your faith. And the way that I encourage you is by really speaking to the brokenness of your humanity and ultimately pointing you to the person of Jesus. That's the encouragement. But that has nothing to do with you at the center. And sometimes you just feel like, maybe if I could just, speak this Joel Osteen message, right? This watered down message. I am creative. I am confident. Right? That's not the church. That's why we want to be different. So that's where I have found myself, and that's where I want to go there. Now, this is where I want to speak to you guys. As I was speaking on Wednesday, one of the things that we talked about as well was, like with Father's Day, sometimes you feel like you just want to speak a message to the fathers, right? Hey, you can do great, you're doing phenomenal, and just keep on pushing forward. Dads, you're broken. You don't need to do better. You just need to surrender your life to Jesus so that he could work through you. Because in your own efforts, you're never going to get it right. And maybe you've kind of, for lack of a better word, you've sucked at life, right? Maybe you haven't done the greatest. That's not your defining moment. Because just like with Elijah, hey, God's not done yet. But this message is not about you. It's about what Christ can do in your life. And now to the rest of the church, I just, men, women, children, everybody, this is how I want to wrap it up. You are part of this ministry. And the only way that we move forward and the church succeeds at its mission is when you understand the mission and when you get to the point where you're willing to be part of that mission and push forward. One example would be if your semi breaks down, if you have a semi, right, a big truck, imagine one person trying to push that up the hill. They'll probably get crushed by it. But if you have a number of people that are pushing with you, that truck will begin to move. You have to be part of that, or there will be no year 7. I can almost say that with certainty. so today's goal is not for discouragement. Here is the encouragement. You are a byproduct because somebody believed that. And we're still here today. So as we close up with year 6, right, and move into year 7, I pray that God will use every one of you guys, that he will empower you by the power of his Holy Spirit. And it doesn't matter how broken you are, because that's why we exist. To reach the broken, not in their defining moments that are good, but even in the defining moments that are bad. So thank you for being part of Epicenter. And I just wanted to take this time to once again just help you to understand why we were established to begin with, and why I pray that we'll continue to be here in our community.